Audio made possible by www.jackettome.com. Audio Fanfiction Productions presents Wide Awake. Fanfiction written by Angskata003. Fanfiction inspired by the Twilight Saga written by Stephanie Meyer. Chapter 47. Double-Stuf Oreos.
Edward's point of view. Sunlight filtered in through an open sliver in the heavy curtains, and bathed my sofa in a dusty beam. I swiftly closed my eyes as I heard her footsteps approaching the front door. I kept my breathing steady, and knew she'd think I was asleep. I always made it a point to feign slumber when she left the house in the mornings. I knew where she was going, and I had only stopped her once. But I almost wished I hadn't. She had gone the whole day and night without liquor, but her body had become so fucking dependent on the alcohol that the withdrawals incapacitated her. She couldn't lift her glass of water without her tremors spilling it over the rim, and she couldn't even keep it down when she eventually managed to drink it. So the next morning, I just acted like I was asleep when she left. I couldn't stop it, and I couldn't watch her leave to buy it. I had been in Chicago for 6 weeks, and I had been living here for 4 of those. My relationship with my mother had become touchy, at best. At worst, it was non-existent. I kept trying to take care of her, and she'd constantly push me away, demanding that I leave so she could just fucking rot away in solitude. It was the most pitiful and pathetic thing I'd ever seen. She wasn't lying when she told me that she spent her days drinking herself into oblivion. I didn't stay because I wanted to watch her wither away. I stayed because I had to believe this life with her, the life I dreamt of for so long, wasn't as awful as it had seemed on the day that I'd arrived. I stayed because I was greedy and craved her acceptance. I stayed because my father had raised me to believe that this woman was infallible and pure and worthy of our unconditional love and respect. I stayed because I wanted it all back, which was ironic because I had come to let it all go. The day I'd mailed the letter to Bella, I felt a little piece of my soul die. Not only was I breaking my promise to her, but I had no idea when or if I'd ever go back to Forks. Truthfully, I existed day by day, because living in the immediate present was the only way of retaining a fraction of optimism. I could imagine her reading it, and I loathed being that motherfucker who probably broke her heart. A little voice in my mind wondered if she wouldn't be better off without me anyways. After all, I was the only thing holding her back from getting better, having basically threatened to leave her if she ended up surrendering to the assistance of some stupid fucking shrink. Looking back, it was probably an unforgivable method of controlling her and binding her to me by limiting her options, and now I found myself hoping that she didn't listen to a word I'd said now that I wasn't there to help her myself. I didn't let these thoughts wander for long, because I couldn't bear to think of Bella finding somebody better once she could, although I knew she deserved it. I'd always known. This whole fucking fiasco only further proves that. I couldn't decide if I wanted her to realize it or not. After resolving to stay in Chicago with my mother, I'd done some shopping for this shithole. It felt wrong using the credit card that Carlisle had given me for emergencies, but I reasoned that he made a whole shitload of money anyways. I'd find a way to pay him back for it all later, because I couldn't buy anything with her money. When I'd asked my mother how she managed to survive with no job, her answer had enraged me. My father had a policy that she received after his death, and the homeowner's insurance on my burned and ruined childhood home had wielded a hefty sum as well. She had been just fucking leeching off of these funds to feed her habits for the last 10 years. It was disgusting and insolent, and if I hadn't thought it possible to lose any more respect for her than I'd already had, I was proven wrong. She had been ashamed to admit how the money that had been intended to put our lives back together had basically just been wasted on her addiction. That was how I had stopped her from drinking for that one day. I'd use her guilt over the money to convince her not to buy any more liquor. Of course, now I was resigned to just listening to her leave the house, listening to her return, and listening to her bedroom door close while she consumed it greedily. I'd never felt so hopelessly fucking incapable of helping someone in my entire life. The alcohol wasn't just an escape to her anymore, it was a chemical necessity. Even though I realized that her problem was likely over my head, I swallowed back the fear of failing and resolved to do it anyways. I bought her food and forced her to eat it. I cleaned her home, if you could call this place a home. I cleaned for days and set down an abundance of traps to capture the rodents that were living in the walls. While watching me mop the floors and scrub the walls and ceilings, she would insist that I stop, and upon realizing that I wouldn't, would meekly offer her assistance, which I always refused. I considered just moving her out of here altogether, but as shitty as this place seemed, she was comfortable here. Somewhere in my mind, I had likened her townhouse to her, and figured that, if I could make the floors and walls clean and livable, maybe I had little hope of fixing her too. I bought her new bedding and pillows, and spent hours scrubbing the grime from her mattress when she refused my repeated offers to buy a new one. The bathrooms were repulsive. She had sobbed various apologies, while she watched me clean up your old vomit from the tiles. My scrubbing eventually made a difference. After 2 weeks, I felt comfortable enough with the state of things. It wasn't pretty or shiny or pristine, but it was as close to inhabitable as possible. My next task was to force her to clean herself. She had lost any habits with regard to hygiene, and it was more than a little appalling. The woman who used to force me to brush my teeth 3 times a day, and wash every inch of my body, had month-old dirt on her feet. She protested before I'd threatened to strip her out of her clothing, and toss her into the bathtub myself. Realizing that I had the physical upper hand, she finally acquiesced. I used the laundromat at the end of the block to sort through and wash her clothing. I threw away more than I washed. The whole business was a lot like taking care of a child, and the constant task of doing so kept my mind distracted from thoughts of forks. I heard her footsteps ascending to the door outside, and remained motionless on the sofa as she entered. She wiped her shoes now that I had made an obvious effort to keep shit clean. I listened as she took her walk down the hall to her bedroom, and closed the door. Even hundreds of miles away in Forks, I'd never felt as far away from her as I did in that moment. That night, after all of the cleaning of the last couple weeks, the questions began. Not just mine, but hers as well.
Please, tell me.
She pleaded for the 3rd time as we sat at the dilapidated kitchen table and ate our takeout. I sighed, and gripped my fork tighter as I speared a carrot. You don't want to know, I replied honestly, glancing up to meet her gaze. Her eyes were bloodshot, and I could tell she wasn't completely sober. She had a brief window of semi-sobriety around dinner time that I always took full advantage of before she retreated to her room, to reacquaint herself with the bottle. She frowned down into her container of food, and poked at it idly. She never ate enough.
It was bad, wasn't it? The people you were with?
She asked in a tiny whisper, without meeting my gaze. Half of my conscience was hesitant about relaying my full experience in the system, because I knew it'd only add to her guilt. I didn't want to be the one responsible for furthering her already violent downward spiral. The other, far less moral half of my conscience wanted to gain the vindication of telling her everything. And shit, did I have stories that would keep her up at night wallowing in guilt over her mistake of sending me away. I just couldn't do it, though. It didn't seem satisfying to watch a shell of a woman become a shell of a woman. It would have been counterproductive and malicious of me to tell her about those experiences. I sighed, and raked my fingers through my hair uncomfortably. Not all of them. It wasn't a lie. She met my gaze and tilted her head a bit in curiosity.
Will you tell me about something?
She requested while taking a small bite of her noodles. It felt awkward telling her about Carlisle. It was like mixing oil and water, and I didn't like the idea of her knowing about that side of my life. Unfortunately, it was the only good experience I had to relay. When I was 13, I was in the hospital with the flu. I began choosing to start from my very first interaction with Carlisle. She dropped her fork and leaned forward while listening intently. Eat your food, or I won't tell anymore, I snapped in annoyance, and she quickly began eating once again. I took a deep breath and began telling her about the man I'd spent the last 5 years of my life with. I told her about his job and how well he took care of me. It was all very mechanical for some reason, but as I spoke I sort of remained emotionless. I noticed that the more I offered her, the more she ate, so I continued and told her about his mansion-sized house in Forks and our nights playing chess together. I even offered a brief description of the town. I sidestepped anything negative about our relationship and kept it as directly related to him as possible. By the end of the story, she had eaten her entire meal and kind of frowned down at the empty container, like she had lost her only means of receiving information from me.
He sounds like a very nice man.
She smiled after a pause and pushed her hair behind her ear. I was still eating, so I simply nodded in agreement as she watched me. I had grown accustomed to being watched while I ate, and a phantom smile tugged at my lips until I realized what I was doing, what I was remembering.
Maybe I could meet him someday,
she hedged, and the noodle I had been swallowing lodged in my throat with a cough. I shook my head vehemently while sputtering into my fist, cringing at the idea of those two coming face to face. I couldn't fathom the thought of Carlisle meeting this woman. It shocked me that I felt this way, but I realized that I'd be completely fucking embarrassed and exposed if he knew about how she lived. Once again, oil and water. After a moment of mutual protest, she eventually dropped the subject, and I allowed her to retreat from the table to her bedroom. I didn't sleep that night as I lay on the sofa and stared at the ceiling. It was risky, and I knew Rebella was likely waiting for me to get just the right amount of incoherence to pop up again. I couldn't decide how I felt about that. She was really fucking annoying, but I hadn't seen her since the day I derived and lost my shit. I was careful about sticking to my pre-Bella sleep rules. Once I'd begun to sway with exhaustion, I'd allow myself sleep to keep the worst symptoms at bay. I couldn't decide if staying awake intentionally for the purpose of seeing her was ridiculous or not. I kept the possibility in the back of my mind, though. If I ever needed her badly enough, all I'd have to do was stave off sleep for as long as possible and she'd be there. I gave my mother the rest of the week to ask her questions, always at the dinner table, when she was the most clear-headed. She wanted to know about my grades and school, which brought up the obvious topic of me missing the last month of my junior year. I shrugged it off and avoided her inquiries about whether or not I'd planned to return. That was just thinking too far ahead, frighteningly far ahead. Nothing that might happen after the sunset each day existed to me. I couldn't bring myself to answer those questions for obvious reasons. I didn't know where I'd be. It felt like being on the other side of the fence again, and though the grass wasn't greener per se, it was familiar, and I had put myself in the position to be responsible for it. As the evenings passed, she began asking me questions that brought a borderline panic into my chest.
How would that happen?
She'd asked one night as we ate, her eyes fixedly scrutinizing the teeth-shaped scar on the side of my neck. My fingers had twitched and I had to restrain myself from fingering Bella's mark on me. Not sure, I'd evaded in a mumble, swiftly changing the subject. "Do you ever talk to Grandma?" I asked craftily, not really interested in discussing the other two people who'd abandoned me, but knowing that the topic would be enough to distract her. Just as I'd expected, her gaze turned wide and anxious.
You mean its parents?
She asked pointlessly while staring into her container of food. I nodded my response and gazed at her expectantly. Of course I didn't mean her parents. I'd never even met them before. I wasn't even sure if they existed. She sighed, and spared me a brief and nervous glance from under her lashes.
They passed away a few years ago. Your grandpa was first,
she whispered, meeting my stunned gaze.
Heart attack,
she explained with an apologetic expression.
Your grandma had a stroke,
she finished in a remorseful mumble. I let the information of my grandparents' death completely permeate before responding. Too bad I never got to apologize to them. They must have. My words were interrupted by the sudden question of whether or not they blamed me for my father's death. After all, they made no attempt to contact me either. I had always assumed the three shared the same sentiment. But now that I knew the truth of why my mother sent me away, did that mean? Her gaze wandered to mine and she swallowed loudly.
It's not what you think,
she whispered, fingering a nearby napkin, as her gaze shifted to its common absolute hollowness.
By the time they realized what had happened, I'd convinced them that you were likely already settled into a new home, with a new family.
she explained in an impassive voice.
They would have wanted you, but I was afraid you'd still be too close to me, so I hid you.
She finished, as if she were explaining the contents of her takeout container, and